Her yellow dress hit the floor before she did, ripped, filthy, shaking, right at the feet of the most dangerous man in the North End. "They hurt my mum," she whispered. Every heartbeat in that private dining room froze. The ghost of the North End looked down at the little girl clutching his sleeve. And in that split second, every man at that table knew. If Jimmy moved the wrong way, that child wouldn't leave alive. So why did the most feared mafia boss in the city suddenly break his own rule? And what did he see on her face that made him stand? Before you hear the answer, this is the story of the mafia boss who chose compassion, and why the city was left completely stunned. The next few seconds would decide if this little girl lived or died. To find out what the ghost of the North End did that shattered every rule, hit the like button, subscribe, and let's get into the rest of this shocking story. The silence in the private room was heavier than the scent of fine leather and cigar smoke. It was a vacuum, immediate and absolute. Every man seated around the long table, all polished chrome, bespoke wool, and contained violence, was frozen, staring. They looked not at the small, shaking figure of Dryan, but at Jimmy. Every eye was waiting for the inevitable brutal consequence of interrupting the boss. Dryan was oblivious to the danger she was in. She didn't let go of Jimmy's sleeve. Her tiny fingers, scraped and grimy, clutched the cuff of his 100-year-old black wool suit like a drowning person holding a life raft. The juxtaposition was visceral, the sheer, raw panic of childhood desperation against the cold, inked architecture of absolute power. Jimmy remained motionless. His gaze, usually cold and assessing, settled on the little girl's face. He catalogued the facts, the exhaustion, the fresh dirt streaking the tears, the thin line of dried blood above her left eyebrow. Then he looked at the hand pointing vaguely across the room, demanding help, demanding a breach in his meticulously maintained wall of indifference. Emotion is a liability. The words echoed in the chambers of his mind, the first principle of his life since he'd taken this seat. Dryan wasn't a business threat, a territorial dispute, or a betrayal. She was worse. She was a liability of the heart. She was a reminder of things he had spent a lifetime burying beneath layers of ink and ice. He had built this empire on the promise of never caring again, of letting the logic of power dictate his actions. To yield now would be to admit weakness to every man at this table. One of his most trusted lieutenants, Sal, shifted in his seat, preparing to move, to neutralize the problem with quiet efficiency. Don't. Jimmy didn't speak the word aloud, but the intensity of his stare locked Sal down. The air thickened further. Dryan, perhaps sensing the focus shift, finally lifted her head fully, her wide brown eyes locked onto his. In that moment, she wasn't seeing the man with the terrifying tattoos that scrolled across his skull and jaw. She was seeing the last flicker of hope in a dark world. A muscle ticked high beneath Jimmy's scarred cheekbone. The pressure building in his chest wasn't rage. It was the slow, agonizing breaking of the decades-old ice that encased his core. He didn't move his large frame, didn't flinch away from the tears soaking the fine wool. He leaned forward just an inch, bringing his lips close to her ear, his voice dropping to a register barely audible above the quiet clinking of the water carafe in the center of the table. It was a voice usually reserved for signing death warrants, but now it was steady, focused, and softer than any man in the room had heard in a decade. "Tony," Jimmy commanded, without looking away from Dryan. "Get the car ready, now." Tony, Jimmy's most trusted man and chief strategist, was the first to move. He was a professional, trained to execute orders instantly, but even his steps paused mid-stride toward the door. He was a man of cold logic, and this order, this intervention, was catastrophic logic. Tony turned back, his face a mask of calculated respect, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of dread. He glanced pointedly at the other lieutenants, whose confusion was palpable. Sal, still locked down by Jimmy's silent order, was sweating lightly. "Boss," Tony said, keeping his voice dangerously low. "With respect. You know what this means. This isn't our territory. We cross that line. It's not a matter of help. It's war. It's bad business, Jimmy. We don't interfere with neighborhood discipline for a loose end." He stopped himself from calling Dryan a liability, but the word hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Jimmy lifted his head slowly. The movement was barely perceptible, yet it felt seismic. He still held Dryan, her small weight resting precariously against his side, her tears drying on his collar. For the first time, he shifted his focus from the child to the man questioning him. His dark eyes, usually reserved for counting money or bodies, were flat, polished obsidian. They did not hold fury. They held something far more terrifying: a total absence of political concern. Jimmy didn't just look at Tony. He looked through him, past the numbers, past the territory, straight to the bedrock of Tony's loyalty. "Tony," Jimmy said, his voice retaining that impossible softness from Chapter 1. It was the softest sound that was also the hardest warning. "You are calculating the cost in currency. I am calculating the cost in blood. Not mine, Tony. Hers." He nudged his head slightly toward Dryan, who was now quietly burrowing into his shoulder, exhausted and spent. "They hurt her mother over pocket change. That is a crime of convenience and cruelty. That is petty." "I do not deal in petty. We are moving. We are intervening. We are fixing a wrong that no ledger could account for." He paused, letting the silence scream the final decree. "It's not business, Tony. It's personal." Jimmy had just crossed a dangerous line, risking war for a little girl he didn't even know. To see the brutal, precise action he took next and find out if her mother survived, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Tony swallowed hard, the last shred of professional protest dissolving under the pressure of that stare. He knew intimately that to push back further was to join the blood column. He gave a curt, formal nod. "Right away, boss. The car is pulled up, and I'll notify Dr. Chen." Jimmy returned his attention to Dryan. He gently peeled her fingers from his coat, standing up to his full, imposing height. He then did the second most shocking thing of the night. He didn't hand her to Tony or Sal. He handed her to a massive, quiet bodyguard named Leo, a man whose face was even less expressive than Jimmy's, but whose hands were surprisingly gentle. "Keep her safe," Jimmy murmured to Leo, his eyes still on Dryan, "and find us the fastest route to that mother." With the crisis secured and the chain of command brutally reaffirmed, Jimmy adjusted his tie, his terrifying facade snapping back into place. The liability of the heart was now a matter of fierce, uncompromising action. The black SUV, built like a tank and silent as a whisper, sliced through the evening traffic. Inside, the atmosphere was tight with unspoken tension. Jimmy sat opposite Tony, his usual spot, but now his hands rested on his knees, not occupied with papers or a phone. Beside him, Dryan sat nestled against the silent bodyguard, Leo, whose massive frame seemed to absorb her distress. As they sped through the city, the initial shock began to wear off, and Dryan started to speak in short, breathless bursts, trying to piece together the nightmare. Tony, a notepad appearing magically in his hand, prompted her gently, knowing the details were crucial for their target. They wanted the money," Dryan whispered, clutching a tiny rabbit charm she had pulled from her pocket. "Mum said we didn't have it yet. The rent was late, but the men kept coming back." Jimmy kept his face impassive, but his dark, tattooed brows furrowed infinitesimally. He didn't interrupt, allowing the raw innocence of her testimony to fill the expensive air. Dryan's account painted a picture of two petty, predictable thugs, cruel, impatient, and utterly lacking in the discipline Jimmy prized. She referred to them only as the noisy one and the big shadow. They grabbed all the flowers out of the pots, Dryan continued, her voice catching. Mum tried to stop them from breaking the window. She said she'd have the money Friday, but the noisy one, he pushed her over the table, and then they were kicking the pots, and the big shadow, he was laughing. And Mum wasn't moving right after that. A fresh wave of tears tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. Did she say their names? Tony asked softly, clicking his pen once. No names. Just the gang sign, Dryan said, pointing vaguely to her cheek. A snake. They always draw a snake on the door when they take the money. Jimmy finally moved. He leaned forward, ignoring Tony's cautionary look. He didn't ask about the perpetrators or the gang. He focused solely on the victim. Your mother. Jimmy's voice was low, gravelly, pulling her attention back. Where did they hurt her? Dryan hesitantly pointed to her own small side, near her ribs, and then mimed shielding her head. She fell on the broken wood, and they pushed her head against the shelf. There was a lot of red. She told me to run to the big man who was always in the fancy restaurant. She said you would know what to do. A fierce protective heat ignited in Jimmy's chest. Not just a liability of the heart, but a target of calculated, contemptible smallness. He knew these types, bottom feeders who brutalized the powerless to feel strong. To touch the weak, to terrorize a child for a small debt, that was an offense to the natural order of power. It was petty, and petty crime always demanded overwhelming, decisive correction. Jimmy looked at Tony, the decision now forged into granite. We find the flower shop, and we find two men, one noisy, one big shadow, and we make sure that snake gang learns what happens when they bite where they shouldn't. Jimmy tapped his fingers lightly against his knee once, the sound barely audible over the hum of the luxury SUV's engine, yet it was enough to snap Tony out of his notes. The destination was set, a rundown block in the industrial sector, far from Jimmy's polished domain. Details, Tony, Jimmy said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where Dryan, now quiet, had drifted off, curled securely against Leo. We're not taking chances with the fallout. Who do we have available? And where are our assets? Tony immediately dropped the notepad and pulled a secure phone from his inner coat pocket, his strategic mind already racing ahead of the crisis. I've already pinged Dr. Chen. He's closing up his practice but is mobilizing the surgical team now. He's expecting a triage situation at St. Jude's, high security, low profile. Jimmy gave a minute nod of approval. Dr. Chen was a man of immense skill and few questions, a necessary component of Jimmy's world. The aggressors, Jimmy continued, his voice hardening, the tattoos on his face seeming to darken under the low cabin light. You heard the description, noisy and a big shadow. And they mark their territory with a snake. That's the Vipers, boss. Bottom-tier garbage. They run petty extortion on this block. Garbage, but territorial, Jimmy observed, looking out at the blurring city lights. Tony, send 3 teams. Not for a fight. For a statement. Team Alpha secures the scene and gets the mother to Chen. Team Beta sweeps the perimeter, finds the local safe houses for the Vipers, and brings me the noisy one and the big shadow. Alive. I want to talk to them. Tony didn't argue this time. He simply executed the command, his fingers flying across the secured device. The orders he relayed were cryptic, efficient, and lethal in their implication, activating the vast, unseen machinery of Jimmy's influence. Tell them to be surgical, Jimmy added, leaning forward to address the driver. No collateral. The point is not bloodshed. The point is precision. We protect the weak, and we annihilate those who profit from their terror. Within minutes, the air crackled with organized activity. Discreet black sedans peeled away from their patrol routes across the city, converging on the target area like shadows drawn to a heat source. The logistics of saving a single unknown mother were now consuming Jimmy's entire empire. As the SUV slowed, turning onto the darkened street where Dryan's mother lay, Jimmy gently reached back and rested his hand on Dryan's shoulder, a silent promise of protection. He glanced at Tony, the man still relaying final commands. "I want that flower shop rebuilt before the sun rises tomorrow, Tony. Better than it was. Pay for it. Pay for the rent. Pay for everything. And make sure those who saw the beating see the correction." The intervention was no longer just about survival. It was about absolute, visible justice. They had arrived. The SUV pulled to a smooth stop, its expensive tires barely disturbing the grit of the alleyway. The air immediately changed, thick with the scent of damp earth, spilled fertilizer, and something metallic, the unmistakable odor of fresh blood. The location was a small, two-story building tucked between a defunct dry cleaner and a boarded-up warehouse. The storefront was clearly a flower shop, now violently mangled. A sheet of plywood, hastily covering a window where glass had once been, bore the crude, chalked outline of a snake, the Viper's calling card. The sight was a raw confirmation of Dryan's terror. Jimmy stepped out, his large, imposing shadow falling over the desolate scene. Team Alpha, a group of silent, highly efficient men, was already there. They had secured the perimeter and established a clear path to the small, inner room where the mother lay. Jimmy walked past the counter, where ceramic pots were shattered and vibrant petals were strewn across the floor like blood confetti. He found the woman behind a work table, nestled in a makeshift shroud of blankets one of his men had provided. She was pale, barely conscious, and fighting to breathe. The bruising was already stark and ugly against her skin, a sickening testament to the thug's brutality. The sight hit Jimmy with the force of a physical blow. This was what Dryan had fled. This was the cost in blood he was determined to settle. He knelt beside her, his tattooed face inches from hers. His hand, the same hand that had just hours ago rested on Dryan's shoulder, gently moved the hair from the mother's face. He looked at one of his medics who was prepping an IV line. "Her name is not the problem," Jimmy said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Her survival is." Tony, appearing immediately, knelt opposite him. "Dr. Chen is on standby. The surgical team is ready. We have a clean transport." Jimmy nodded, glancing back at the car where Dryan was still sleeping, guarded by Leo. He knew she couldn't see this. "Get her out," he ordered the medics. "Fast and clean. Tony, you ride with her. Ensure security is absolute at St. Jude's. No visitors, no complications. If anything happens, if she doesn't make it, I want the Viper's leader brought to me. I want him to witness the rebuilding of this shop before I personally rebuild his life from scratch." As the medics carefully loaded the stretcher, Jimmy turned away from the mother, his commitment to her rescue finalized. He had two priorities left: Dryan, who needed safe harbor away from this devastation, and vengeance, which demanded a precise and shocking execution. He strode back to the SUV, checked on the sleeping child one last time, and then pointed the driver toward the nearest warehouse. His face, illuminated by the flashing lights of the departing ambulance, was a mask of cold determination. The reckoning was about to begin. The warehouse smelled of wet concrete and rust, a far cry from the opulent dining room where Jimmy's night had begun. In the center of the vast, cold space, illuminated by a single harsh industrial lamp, two figures were secured to steel chairs. These were the aggressors, the noisy one, vicious, a skinny man whose eyes darted wildly, and the big shadow, Spike, whose bulk was useless now, his face pale with shock and fear. Team Beta had been precise. Jimmy entered the light alone, his massive, tattooed silhouette swallowing the edges of the room. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply stood before them, a picture of quiet, controlled disappointment. Vicious tried to bluster, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Who the hell are you? This is Viper territory. You got no business here, man. Jimmy didn't acknowledge the threat. He walked slowly around the chairs, his tailored suit an insult to their filth. You took $67 from a woman who sells flowers, Jimmy stated, his voice a low, heavy rumble that contained all the fury he refused to release. Then when she couldn't pay, you shattered her livelihood and her body. Tell me, vicious Spike, what code do you follow? Spike, the big shadow, looked away, silent. Vicious, however, kept up his bravado. It's how we do business, boss. Gotta make an example. Gotta keep the fear alive. Jimmy stopped directly in front of Vicious. He gently reached into the man's pocket and pulled out a wad of dirty small bills, the paltry profit from their night's work. Fear, Jimmy repeated, almost musing. I deal in fear. I built an empire on it. But my fear is a promise of swift, inevitable consequence for those who cross me. Your fear, Vicious, is cheap. It's petty. It's the cruelty of a coward who needs to kick someone already on the ground. He tossed the cash onto the floor. You hurt the truly helpless. That is a violation. It makes you a pathetic footnote in a world that respects power, and I cannot allow petty disrespect to stain my city. Jimmy stepped back. I'm not going to beat you. That would be messy and predictable. He signaled to a guard, who placed a large, clear jar next to the aggressors. You have 24 hours to fill that jar with $10,000, Vicious. Every cent goes to Dryan's mother for her care and to rebuild her shop. But that's not your punishment. Jimmy pointed toward the empty, cold, concrete floor. Your punishment is this. You and Spike will spend the next 3 months, every single morning, cleaning the streets of this neighborhood. You will be seen. You will be known. You will be doing community service, protecting the very people you terrorized. If one flower is damaged, if one shopkeeper is harassed, if you fail to show up, I will know. And then, the real reckoning begins. Jimmy's eyes were cold and uncompromising. You will pay with time, and you will pay with humility, but mostly, you will pay with the destruction of your reputation. The neighborhood will know who saved them, and it won't be you. The next morning, the sun rose over the neighborhood to find the flower shop completely transformed. Team Alpha had worked through the night. The shattered window was replaced with new, flawless glass. The broken shelving was gone, replaced by strong, fresh wood. And the floor, once stained with blood and dirt, gleamed with disinfectant and polish. New, vibrant flowers stood in tidy rows. But the real focus of the neighborhood was not the shop itself, but the sidewalk outside. At precisely 6 a.m., 2 figures appeared. They were Vicious and Spike, still wearing the clothes from the night before, their expressions a mixture of fear and profound public humiliation. They carried brooms and shovels. Under the quiet but unwavering gaze of 2 of Jimmy's largest men, they began to clean the street. The shop owners and residents, emerging for their morning routines, stopped and stared. Whispers traveled like wildfire. The Vipers, the petty tyrants who had ruled the block through cruelty, were doing manual labor. They were sweeping the very ground they had commanded others to fear. This was the shocked everyone moment. Not the sight of a rival gang beaten into pulp, but the sight of a crime boss enforcing justice through community service and public shame. Vicious, the noisy one, tried to maintain some bravado, puffing out his chest, but his movements were stiff, desperate. He caught the eye of Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery next door, who simply looked at him with cold, quiet victory before turning her back. The true punishment, the destruction of his fearsome identity, had begun. Later that morning, a sleek black car pulled up. Jimmy emerged, impeccably dressed. He surveyed the scene, the pristine flower shop, the defeated thugs cleaning the curb, the small crowd of residents watching with a mixture of confusion and dawning relief. Jimmy walked straight to Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery. He didn't order anything. He simply pulled out a massive, clean wad of cash and handed it to her. "For your windows last year, Mrs. Rodriguez, and for the loss of business." He then did the same for the barber down the street and the laundromat owner, covering every reported debt the Vipers had enforced in the last 6 months. He wasn't paying them off. He was making the Vipers irrelevant. Jimmy's message was clear. There was a new code, and it was enforced by a far greater power. He left as quietly as he arrived, the entire spectacle, the restitution, the humiliation, the sheer unexpected moral dimension, executed without a single word of threat to the neighborhood itself. He had proven that his power could serve as protection, a realization that was more shocking and infinitely more lasting than any act of violence. This wasn't just justice. It was a revolution enforced by the city's most feared man. If this story changed the way you see power and protection, hit the like button, leave a in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories of redemption. Weeks later, the rhythm of the neighborhood had settled into a new, unfamiliar tranquility. The Vipers were a ghost story, their influence completely eradicated not by a bloody turf war, but by a quiet, humiliating public dismantling. Vicious and Spike, diminished and stripped of their false power, were finishing their mandatory service elsewhere, a daily reminder of Jimmy's uncompromising reach. The flower shop, now gleaming and vibrant, was bustling with customers, many drawn by word of the silent protection it now carried. The mother, whose name was Lena, was back behind the counter, fully recovered. Her scars were fading, but her resilience was stronger than ever. The biggest change was the inclusion of a black SUV that appeared every Tuesday afternoon, parking discreetly down the street. It was never announced, and it never lingered. This Tuesday, just like the last few, Jimmy walked the short distance alone. He wore a simple, expensive cashmere coat over his suit. He looked just as intimidating as he did on the night he was interrupted. The complex tattoos still a map of a brutal history, yet the atmosphere around him had shifted. The residents who saw him now nodded, not in fear, but in a mixture of respect and gratitude. Jimmy didn't conduct business. He didn't make demands. He simply entered the shop, which smelled wonderfully of hyacinths and fresh earth. Dryan, sitting at a small table coloring, would look up and her face would bloom into a wide, trusting smile. She would run to him, not trembling with fear, but with the boundless energy of a happy, safe 7-year-old. Jimmy would kneel, a difficult and unnatural gesture for a man of his size and rigidity. He'd listen to her tell him about her favorite flower, the purple iris, or her latest drawing. He'd answer in that low, controlled rumble without ever once asking about her mother's injuries or the thugs. Lena watched this routine from the counter, a silent understanding passing between them. He had taken her pain and given her family security. She had given him a silent, vital connection back to his own lost humanity. Today, Dryan presented him with a picture, a large purple iris, and next to it, a stick figure of a man with large, dark markings drawn on his face. "That's you," Dryan stated proudly. "You're my protector flower." Jimmy took the drawing. He didn't smile, but the lines around his eyes softened. He simply folded the drawing once, carefully, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, the one usually reserved for highly sensitive documents. "Thank you, Dryan," he said. He placed a small, simple bouquet of purple irises on the counter for Lena, and without another word, turned and left. As his car pulled away, Tony, who had been waiting down the block, saw the drawing tucked securely into the boss's inner pocket. He no longer saw a liability. He saw a man who had finally chosen to fight for something more meaningful than turf. Jimmy sat in his office that evening, the highest room in the city, the silence more profound than ever. It was the kind of silence that used to be his shield, cold, calculating, and absolute. Now it felt different. It felt like space. He unlocked his safe, not to retrieve ledgers or weapons, but to carefully place the folded drawing inside. Dryan's protector flower was now the most valuable asset in his vault. He remembered Tony's question from weeks ago. You know what this means? It's bad business. Tony had only been half right. It had been bad business for the Vipers, whose territory had been vaporized overnight, their reputation shattered by humility and public defeat. But for Jimmy, it was the best business decision of his life. The protection of the mother and child had cost him resources and had risked a political tangle, yet it had bought him back something he hadn't known was missing. Meaning. The heavy gold watch on his wrist, the endless accounts of money, the obedience of his men. None of it had been able to breach the walls of grief and cold logic he had erected. It wasn't until Dryan's small, desperate hand clutched his sleeve that the truth became clear. The real source of strength wasn't the ability to inflict pain, but the capacity to choose protection. His power, once wielded solely for accrual and control, had found a higher purpose. Jimmy stood and walked to the panoramic window, looking out over the grid of the city he controlled. He was still the boss. He was still feared. But now, that fear was tethered to a new code, an uncompromising, immediate response to any violence directed at the weak. He was a man whose soul had been saved not by a preacher or an honest woman, but by a terrified 7-year-old girl who saw past the terrifying ink and the sharp suit to the man who could make her mother safe. Dryan hadn't run to the Mafia Boss for mercy. She had run to him for justice, and in delivering it, Jimmy had finally found his own redemption. He traded his old, isolating code of fear for the simple, true strength of love. Thank you for watching to the end. I believe you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting stories like this lined up for you already. So click the image showing on your screen to watch the next. Don't forget to subscribe.